I just want to say thank you for letting me sit in today. It's always a great opportunity to talk about assessment, one of my favorite topics. I'm not sure that everyone can say that as a passion area, but I always appreciate when I'm with people that have a common appreciation. Um, so for our session today, I did just want to kind of tell you a little bit about how I'm framing the conversation. So in Indiana, I'll give you a little bit of context momentarily about my background and expertise. But most recently, in serving as a consultant, one of the things that I've been really wrestling through is how to make sure that educators are understanding kind of the foundational pieces of assessment. I think obviously many educators use assessment widely, but may not understand some of the principles and ideas in terms of formulating those assessments. So what I've really tried to foster is coming from a background of more standardized assessments, how can we take some of those principles and ideas and kind of deconstruct them in a way that's consumable at the classroom level? So that's really going to be the essence of my presentation today. So for some of you, you will say, I know this content and understand these ideas, and that's wonderful. But I hope that one of the key takeaways is how can we kind of step a bit into a space where we can also take some of our technical expertise and present it in a way that is maybe more consumable for those where assessment isn't their passion area. So that's going to be the perspective that I'm sharing today. So in terms of that conversation, what I hope to be able to do is kind of walk through some of the foundational elements that I think are important that educators understand and how I've tried to frame some of those ideas for them. Also, just the idea of developing a blueprint in relationship to classroom assessments as well. So just a point on this specifically. I think it's very common for educators to take something off the shelf or whatever electronic format exists and deliver that without a lot of thought about what was intended to be assessed. So with that blueprint development, really taking a thoughtful process step and thinking about what content did I intend to really measure through that classroom assessment. And then we'll touch a little bit on item writing and scoring and some of those ideas as well. So currently I serve as an independent consultant here in Indiana, and I work with a variety of schools and districts and also assessment organizations as they're trying to think about how to best navigate the educational landscape and all of the things that are happening in a state. My prior work was, as mentioned, in Indiana at the Indiana Department of Education. I spent about 13 years there in totality, and most of my work there was actually in the assessment office, and most specifically building out new assessment programs as they were legislated as the state's assessment director. And then I also served for some time as the chief academic officer as well. And what was beneficial about each of those roles was that through the chief academic officer, I was also able to really connect how the standards tie into assessment. So using that assessment background, how do we make sure that we're very thoughtful about how the standards are ultimately aligning to that assessment content, which again is going to be part of our conversation today. I've also had some experience with Smarter Balanced at a point in time and done a variety of things. So I started as a classroom teacher in math specifically. And so there's always a part of me that kind of relates a lot of the work that I do back to what I wish I would have known as a classroom teacher. And so that's kind of the lens also that really helps guide some of this conversation today. So when I start the conversation around assessment, I try to begin by really talking about two terms that I think are maybe misunderstood or wrongly interpreted, possibly depending on who's having the conversation. But it's very common, I think, in the world of standardized and high stakes assessments for assessments to be termed as invalid, or the results to be termed as invalid. That's a common phrase that kind of is tossed around, whether it's in media or in classrooms or hallways. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to try to unpack for educators what is the essence of validity when we're trying to articulate that something is valid or not. And so we spend some time and again, the big caveat I will say here is if you are a technical person in assessment, you will probably poke holes in this definition, and that's okay. But the purpose of my presentation is how to engage educators in some of this dialogue and not necessarily overwhelm them with the precise expectations of technical expertise. So with validity, what we're really trying to say is that we are attuned to the content that we're trying to assess with students, and that we understand the potential interpretations that result from that content. So again, there are more elaborate ways that we can explain that, but at the essence, when we're talking with educators, what's most important is, do they understand the content that they're trying to assess? Are they soliciting items that align to that content? And from those results, are they able to make interpretations that are reasonable based on that content? One thing I meant to mention, and I apologize, it is slightly in the wrong order, but I also, in rolling out this work with educators in Indiana, I did put out a short guidebook that kind of encompasses these same ideas. So if anything that I say today is helpful, this exists as well. So in terms of validity, one thing that I think is helpful is to help frame some of these conversations in examples and non-examples. Because sometimes it's easier to kind of understand why a non-example doesn't make sense in terms of what we're trying to talk about. So I'm just going to pause here and give you a moment to kind of read through both of these, and then we'll have a quick conversation. So again, feel free to use the chat or whatever is the most common way that you all kind of share ideas here on these calls. But I would love to kind of hear your perspective about, do you ever see instances of maybe the non-example actually being an example that is used in classrooms? Do you ever see people applying a misinterpretation to their data set or connecting it in a way that isn't necessarily aligned to their assessment?
I would just like to say, in addition to what Yarek said, essentially, assessment needs to see what students know, not what they do not know.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What?
So the other concept that I think is sometimes used, maybe without, a real strong frame of thinking, is reliability. So I think that this one is probably underutilized when we think about assessment development in terms of where people kind of focus attention. So again, in my experience, people are much more common to talk about validity and less common to talk about reliability. But I think all of you likely can appreciate how important it is to address both of these elements. So how consistently can an assessment provide a student score if in theory it was provided multiple times? And then the other piece related to this that I think is really important in the classroom space is also thinking about when students are scored subjectively or across classrooms and you're trying to make comparisons for student data, how important reliability comes into that conversation as well. And so this is an area where if we're trying to assess rigor and moving beyond multiple choice, do we also have the infrastructure in place to ensure some level of reliability across the scoring of student work as well? And one of the things that I think is continuing to grow and kind of bolster, just again, anecdotally based on my experience, is the use of collaborative teams and PLCs where some of these conversations can be happening. But I think there is still a very wide continuum in terms of how those conversations are actually still happening. So this is one that, again, I think in my own mind, especially at the classroom level, is as important as validity, just because we want to make sure as we're scoring student work that it's consistent and meaningful.
Flores, could I interject here for just a moment?
Yeah.
I just had a question about this. Um, I'm trying to approach this like from a higher ed lens here. What would your recommendations be for creating like a system of norming for either instructors or evaluators at the higher ed level that would be carrying this work out to ensure that reliability is consistent across you know, different course sections there?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I guess one question I would have back is there an infrastructure in place to where you're able to have some of those collaborative conversations, or are the structures set up to where everyone's kind of an island to where those conversations aren't happening? That's something I just don't know the answer to.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but I think if you have peers or colleagues, ideally those conversations can be happening there. The other way from like a technical assessment perspective is it's also common to have papers read more than one time when you're establishing those norms kind of at the very first point of field testing and moving items operational. So even if you don't have a peer, if you pull a sample of papers to say, I'm going to score this set twice and see if I get the same thing that I got the first round. And then you would also be able to kind of calibrate on your own scoring practices. Or at least
Thank
know
you.
how variant they are. Okay, I'm going to move past those examples just because I want to make sure that we're able to get through the content today. But one of the things that I really try to center on my conversations is that it's so important for the assessment to have value. So with a lot of schools that I work with in Indiana, and I'm going to make the assumption that this happens outside of Indiana, that assessment is overused. So we've had a cliche in education for quite a while that everyone is data rich. So I'm just going to assume that since that is even a statement, that everyone has plenty of assessments that they're giving. But I think it's so important, especially at the classroom level, that educators are very intentional about when and how they're giving assessments to their students. So if we already know that assessment is a frequent practice, one, how are we using the information that we already have? And then two, is there a way to get any new and different information by the assessment that you're giving? So what commonly happens in the assessment space is we have all this multitude of assessment data. It's triangulated. There's strong alignment between all of the data. This test is highly predictive of this test and all of these things. And so what we get to is lots of data. It's all highly related. And then we don't have a good way of getting any new information. So also being clear about if I'm already giving assessments that measure certain things very well, are there also ways as a classroom teacher that I can assess differently to get insight into certain elements that the high stakes assessments can't already do? So as an example, in some states, there are standards that have students draw, like geometry shapes as an example. In a high stakes assessment, those kinds of things typically get converted into a multiple choice item, and then the student picks the shape. Well, if you go back to the intent of the standard, the intent of the standard was to have students draw. So as a classroom teacher thinking about what was the intent of the standard, how is it assessed in a standardized way? Does it still really give me the right information? Or as a classroom teacher, should I do something different to make sure I know if students really understand that content?
Can I jump in again?
Yes.
Okay, so real briefly here. So from your vantage point here, what distinguishes assessments that genuinely improve student learning from assessment that simply satisfies a school or an institutional reporting requirement?
Yeah. So one of the things that we'll probably talk about at some point in this session is that standardized assessment has certain limitations. One of the limitations being that everyone is incredibly concerned about time. So we can't have tests that go on for days. Everyone is also concerned about how much money tests cost. So you can't have a lot of items that are scored by a person, because when you pay people to score items, those cost money. So when you think about some of the limitations that standardized assessments have, they truly can't get to the desire of detail that a classroom educator can truly try to understand from their perspective, without like completely undoing all that standardized assessment is. Even when you think about how the blueprint is constructed itself, it's trying to sample all of the content for a given school year. As a classroom teacher, you have the flexibility to segment that content into more reasonable units or timeframes. And so again, the level of detail is much different than what the standardized assessment can even accomplish. But those kinds of conversations, to be honest, we never really have. We tend to have the conversation that we think the summative assessment or the standardized assessment should be able to do all of these things. And from people who build assessments, they know that they can't. Like, it's not reasonable for them to be able to do that. So this is trying to kind of take the perspective of, if you know that the standardized assessment is so limited, how can you kind of frame what your collection mechanism or evaluation or test is doing to better understand students' performance and outcomes, knowing that on the summative assessment, you won't know that information.
Gotcha.
I saw someone come off mute, so if
Yes,
anybody else wants to jump in.
It was me. So I don't know if my question is valid, but I just had a
moment, like as an instructional designer, when I'm helping my faculty to design assessments, summative assessments, then in a course, like we do start with the end game, like the learning objectives, and then say, but how do I prove that it is valid? Again, that question comes back. So say for an at the end of the course, they do a presentation, or they do a I don't know, a community project where they design a campaign. Uh, then how is that? How do the institution generalize it as it is valid or not? I'm not sure even I'm asking the right question here, but I'm like, I'm just thinking about the course, but I'm not thinking like, how is it valid? And it is reliable. The faculty knows because he has seen the student work through it. He or she has seen that the students learn something. But then again, how do we, yeah, how do we, the validity and reliability is still in my mind.
Enrique added some things to the chat too, if it's helpful. And I'll just say, I don't know that I have a great answer to that question. I mean, I think that's a very complex question in terms of what are we trying to evaluate students on? I mean, that's fundamentally what we're trying to be able to do either with an assessment or whatever else the culminating activity might be. And then what evidence do we have that they can do those things? And do we have confidence by the evidence that collectively then they have met that objective?
So that is subjective. That is what I'm meaning. Like when
Yeah.
you say that by like collectively we have to be make it valid that they have learned. So it is subjective in a sense.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I know I'm confusing you with your question. You have enough content to cover. Sorry, but that was helpful. Yeah.
No, that's fine. So then the other thing that we spend some time talking about with educators is just the continuum of formative, interim, and summative assessments. And so in this continuum, what I try to deconstruct is a little bit of the variety of assessment itself. And so we have the highly summative, highly standardized assessments on the far right, and then the more formative components to the left. And I think what's important to consider is just as part of classroom instruction, most teachers are already functioning in the formative space on any given day because they're always collecting data and information, either through observations, some sort of anecdotal evidence, and so forth. So formative assessment is happening consistently. However, we don't always talk about the reliability of those formative assessments. So are we always calling on the same student? Are we tailoring questions in a certain way for certain populations of students? So is our reliability of the formative assessment being maintained? And that may be something that we don't ever really talk about. So when I do classroom observations, some common patterns that happen are kind of what I've indicated, where there's certain populations of students that are asked or respond consistently to a teacher. So there's not always a variety of students that are being asked questions, or certain populations of students are being asked different types of questions than other populations of students. So thinking about how you're even going through good questioning practices in a classroom can impact as well. The other thing that I wanted to note here is this kind of diagram has been helpful just in terms of thinking through also the low stakes versus high stakes. So like those examples that I gave early on with validity, it's important to think about also how you're going to use the information. So if you are taking a grade, or this is going to be based on a student having access to a subsequent course. Those are obviously different stakes than a student receiving small group or intervention the next day. So being very cognizant of, I'm going to do an exit ticket with 5 items and determine which small group they're in tomorrow. The considerations around validity and reliability are much different than if it's going to be used to determine which course a student's going to be into for the next school year. Okay, so I also think that this conversation around blueprint development is really important for educators to consider, specifically around how they determine how many items they need to know that a student has mastered the content. So what I'm going to share in here is, again, just my perspective based on working on some of the standardized assessments for some time. There may be other guidelines that exist in different spaces that are used. But again, I think educators often struggle with how many items should I even be asking for content and for knowing if a student truly has mastered a certain standard. So I've tried to give them some guardrails a little bit just to help guide some of that work. So in the blueprint, we're trying to think about what are the standards or the learning objectives that we're trying to assess. What are the kinds of items that best assess that content and how many of them might I need? And then also really making sure that the content I select aligns with the purpose and intent of the results. So again, this is from my work at a state department thinking about summative assessment. So when we were constructing assessments, we typically tried to create blueprints that had about 8 to 10 items or points per reporting category or domain to ensure reliability. So that kind of point is helpful for teachers to understand. If you only give a student one item, can they truly show you if they've understood the content or not? And so when you think about a classroom assessment, again, an exit ticket with one item versus a higher stakes purpose, you may need more items in order to have confidence if that student knows the content or not. One item that's multiple choice likely does not give you that level of information. So then we kind of unpack that a little bit more to think about how do we get to the point that these summative assessments have 30, 40, 50 items. So depending on how many domains or reporting categories you're using, if you take that 8 to 10 and multiply it out, that's how you get to the length of some of our very common summative assessments. So then I give them this example of a blueprint. And first, many educators haven't constructed a blueprint before. So even getting to the point that we're having this conversation is new and different. But then we start talking about, if you were looking at this blueprint, and I'll stop talking here in a second so you can look at it. But if you were looking at this blueprint, what would you say is the most important content for students? So I'm going to pause and let you think about that, and nobody respond because I want everyone to think about it. So I'd love to hear either in chat or out loud some thoughts and opinions about, based on how this assessment is being constructed, what do you think is the most important content? Okay, so we have a vote for 2 and 3 in here. Does anyone have a different opinion?
2 and 3 the same.
I was waiting for someone to say
I would
4.
vote for 4.
Okay, so my 4 people, I would love to hear from you because we have our rationale for the 2 and 3. So what's our rationale for the 4? Higher skill levels. Okay.
Sorry, it's easier to talk, so I just unmute myself. But it's like 4 points for one question, and then it is looking at a higher. Uh, it's an open-ended question, so it's like more of analysis kind of question on the Bloom's taxonomy, if I'm thinking. So it definitely higher on the cognitive level. So standard 4 for me.
Okay. So if we were constructing the blueprint purely based on the point values that we have, 2 and 3 would be the highest, because I think we can all see clearly that it's 7 points for each of those. However, what makes this a little bit complicated is that last standard with 4 points. So if you go purely based on percentages or proportions or whatever you want to use, 4 is less than 2 and 3, but it also is an open-ended item, which gives everyone kind of pause. So I'm going to speak to what probably is a common strategy in classrooms if they really wanted to think about making standard 4 worth more. So if you were a teacher, you might say, well, I'm just going to double standard 4. So whatever students get on standard 4, I'm going to double it so I know for sure that it's counting more on my assessment. So now let's talk about if teachers wanted to use that as a strategy, what potential risks do they have in doing that? So if they decide, yes, absolutely standard 4 is more important, I'm going to double the score of 4. What's a risk in doing that?
In terms of what you were describing earlier regarding the things that people concern themselves with in developing the assessment, you said time and money. And so time being an issue here in particular, where if they were going to double this, it's going to usually take the students longer to demonstrate whatever the task is at hand than it would for potentially standard 3 with or standard 2 or 3 with 3 multiple choice and 2 open-ended items. So is time being an issue in terms of the assessment component that the students are going to be carrying out? So maybe that would be an issue with putting so much emphasis on number 4.
Okay, that definitely could come into play. And as Nancy mentioned, you could add another question. So you could have more than just a 4-point question. The other thing that I would just raise going back to reliability is depending what rubric you're using to score this is how consistently is that last item being scored. So are there any concerns about the reliability of that item if it's a 4-point item, and depending on who's scoring it, like do we have confidence that it's going to be scored consistently? The other thought that you could kind of consider with standard 4 is also just trying to make sure that the other standards are kind of proportionally appropriate. So is there a strong rationale that we want to have 7 points for 2 and 3, or should those dials actually be turned to be a lower direction? So these are the conversations that as an educator, and you're trying to think like, what does my test even mean? And how can I justify what I'm doing? These are the kind of questions that you want to be thinking about. If standard 4 is not a quality item, and then you just double the score that a student gets, you're kind of introducing a lot of error potentially into that student's score. So that's another piece to keep in mind is, are you really sure that item's a good item? So we're going to talk about what makes the good item next.
Can I ask another question real quick before we move
Yeah.
on? Just as you're talking about ensuring, alignment with standards, items, and the overall blueprinting process here, and then trying to frame this in, the conversation around higher education. As faculty members, often will design, a lot of their assessments independently. Would a more formalized, blueprinting process be something that would be valuable in higher education? And if so, what might that look like?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to describe it in like the 60-second version. So the 60-second version would be, when you sit down to construct a test, you would list out all of the standards or learning objectives that you're trying to assess on the blueprint. So like, I would do it in a spreadsheet. I'm a spreadsheet person. So like my first column would be all of the things that I'm trying to assess in my spreadsheet. Then the next thing I would do is think about, with those learning objectives, which are more important and least important. So the things that are more important, you're going to want to assign higher point values to. The things that are least important, you're going to assign lower point values to. And as you're assigning point values, you can then kind of determine which of the learning objectives are equal in importance, and which of them are kind of lower and equal in importance, and start to build kind of a distribution of your assessment at that point. And then based on how many learning objectives and all the points and all the things, you may get to a point at some point in that exercise where you're like, I have way too much stuff on this assessment. Like this is not humanly possible even for a student to do. And that's when your dials start turning, right? So then you start thinking, do I need all of these learning objectives to truly say that a student has mastered the content? Or are there some that are so low importance that I'm going to remove them altogether? And then in terms of the point values, that's also where you start turning dials and you think about, do I want a certain number of these items aligned to this objective, or does that just feel too much? But it's important to think about, when you're constructing the blueprint, which learning objectives you truly want to have enough evidence collected to say that a student has mastered that content. So when you go back to, like on a summative assessment, we have 8 to 10 items. Like, are there some learning objectives or standards where you want to have confidence that they know that? Those are going to be either the most numbers of items on your assessment, or if they're open-ended, like the most number of points.
Gotcha.
It was probably more than 60 seconds, but that's how I would do it.
That's okay. That's okay. I appreciate the thoughtful response there.
Okay. Okay, so the next thing that I have here are item types. And again, in education, I don't know that we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about the best way that we're soliciting evidence from students. So we tend to go highly efficient types of items. And then the least efficient tend to kind of get moved to another space. So when we think about item types, I want to go back to the idea of validity again and think about, how do I know that students have mastered certain content by the way I've elicited evidence from them? So if a standard says draw and I give them a multiple choice item, does that provide me the same type of evidence? And so that's kind of the conversation that we would want to be having when we're selecting the items that we're presenting to students. So I know all of the reasons why we can't always do that. But I do just want to say, if all of what we're doing was an ideal scenario, we would try to align the standard content directly with how we're soliciting the evidence from students. So again, multiple choice tend to be very easy to score, commonly available. Most educational assessments will use multiple choice. Multiple select are also very common. The one thing I would say with multiple select, if this is the item type that you commonly use, is the difficulty of that item changes significantly if you tell students how many to select or if you leave it open-ended. So if you say like, choose all that apply, that is a much more difficult item for students than if you say select two. Mm-hmm. Fill in the blank and matching items. Again, there's a lot of different ways that these can be constructed. If they're fill in the blank where students actually have to come up with the term, those are much more difficult than if you're giving them like a drop down or a way that is kind of populated somehow. And then short response and writing prompts or essays are the ones that, from a classroom perspective, can sometimes best align to the content, but also take the most time and also can be impacted by inconsistency in scoring. So when we choose item types, the main thing is thinking about the content that is going to be assessed. So the focus should be the standard, the learning objective, what are students supposed to be able to do by mastering this content? And then how do I construct an item or choose an item that solicits evidence to where I know that students have mastered that content? So this is an example again, and this is a grade 3 standard. So I always pick examples that I figure everyone can probably relate to. So this is content that hopefully everyone understands. So grade 3 geometry, if we look at this for standard, this is the Indiana standard. Define, identify, classify four-sided shapes such as rhombuses, rectangles, and squares as quadrilaterals, and then identify and draw examples and non-examples of quadrilaterals. So I'm going to pause here, and I'd like to have you think about what are the variety of item types that we could even explore if we were trying to assess this content. And this is no judgment on how the standard's constructed. This is just how we would assess it. So again, when we think about high-stakes summative assessments, they're likely going to use multiple choice to assess the standard. But as a classroom educator, if we were really trying to understand that students could do all of the things that are listed within here, we would likely need to include things that aren't just multiple choice. So hopefully that was the conclusion that you came to. So making a good test item. In the world of AI, we have a great thought partner, so that's wonderful. But we do still need to think about, at the end of the day, if we're using AI or some other mechanism, how can we be sure that we actually have a good item before we put it in front of students? So again, we always want to verify the alignment. So if you're using AI or a tool, giving them the standard that you're trying to align to, and not just like the essence of the standard or using different words for the standard, like what is the true standard? And then we also want to think about how would students say those things? So sometimes as adults, we come up with vocabulary and even our AI partners will use vocabulary that students aren't familiar and understand. So we need to think about the vocabulary that's required based on the standard. So sometimes there's terms in the standard or the learning objective where we have to use a certain word because that's what the standard says. But outside of that, are there other flexibilities that we should be thoughtful about? So there's three key things that I would offer in terms of how you can make sure that an item is really accessible. The first is this idea of text density. So if you have a sentence like the one that we just read in the standard that has a lot of nouns, a lot of verbs, a lot of language features, meaning that there's clauses and it kind of just goes on and on and on, that is very difficult for students cognitively to understand what they're supposed to do with all of that information. So a general recommendation is shorter sentences without clauses and without extra text in terms of nouns and verbs helps them be able to consume and narrow down what is it exactly that they're supposed to do within the item. And then as I just mentioned, vocabulary, using vocabulary that's appropriate to the standard. Obviously, sometimes those terms can be a lot for students to process, but if they're within the content standard, then it is what it is typically. But if you're introducing other things to the item to make it more complex, being very thoughtful about, is that actually of benefit to the students to have that complexity added? So this is just an example. So when we think about this item, Jacob wants to see the newest dinosaur movie with 5 friends from his school. Each ticket costs $6 for the 7 o'clock time. So when we think about some of the things that we just talked about, is there anything that jumps out at you here in terms of how information is presented, the density of it, the vocabulary that's used, clauses? Does anything jump out in terms of areas we could refine?
These 6 nouns.
Okay. The times are
Joel said,
relevant. Okay.
Yep. We don't necessarily need to know the topic of the movie as well.
Okay.
I guess.
So especially when we're thinking about like multilingual learners, so you want to make sure that you're conscious of when they come to a word that's unknown, is it relevant to what I'm asking? So is the dinosaur movie really relevant to what they're trying to do?
Mm-hmm. Scott threw out there, what are we asking?
Mm-hmm.
Time, his preference, cost. Yep. And then, Nancy actually threw a good one out here as well, having the like consistent formatting.
Yeah.
Here, so yeah, with the numbers in 2 different formats.
Mm-hmm. So again, depending on, if a teacher is writing this themselves or they're pulling it from their curriculum resource or they're using AI, given all of the variety of places these things can come from, it's important to kind of keep in mind, even when it gives you an item, are there ways that we should be thinking about refining it to make it most accessible for students?
Irene.
We've got a hand raised from Irene
Yes.
here. Sorry, Enrique.
Yeah.
Irene, go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is a short question in terms of the objective for this project.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that they want to see this dinosaur movie and therefore then they're going to get the friends and they have to assess how much it's going to cost them?
Yeah. So
Begin
essentially
with why?
they will get to the question. So this is just the stem that's kind of giving them the context for the item. And
Okay,
then
so they
there
will
will
get
be
the
like a
why before.
calculation that they have to do. Mhm.
They will get the why before.
Oh, can they get the why before? Mhm.
Yes. Because otherwise, what's the point? I mean, there
Yeah.
could be a lot of movies, and maybe not everybody wants to go see that movie. It's the question of everybody wants to see this movie. Therefore, okay, we have to figure out how much it's going to cost us so we can all
Yeah.
go.
And Joel in the chat, he already solved all of our problems because he proposed the revised text for us. Okay. Well, in the spirit of time, I'm going to move on. I think I have a few other things here. Okay. So the other thing that is important to keep in mind is if distractors can be helpful. So when we think about multiple choice items, sometimes we may just make up other things to go within the multiple choice item that are the incorrect response without thinking about a rationale for those. And so one idea is to also thoughtfully construct those distractors to where if they're intentional misconceptions, they could be used as part of data analysis as well. So you could have an example.
Hi, how are you?
Excuse me.
I forgot to put my sign up.
You could have an example where, excuse me, the options reflect the student subtracting the two numbers, so 3 minus 2, where they just pick a random number. There's obviously always, you want to have the correct response there, but then you could also use multiplication errors. So if you construct some of the items to have clear misconceptions, when you're looking for patterns in what students know or don't know, they could also use some of that information as well. Okay, and then this is going to be one of the last things that we kind of dig into. So we have talked a little bit about blueprint development and how we think about what content should be on our assessment. This idea is once you know the content, how do you put it in an organizational way where you want students to react to it? So I'd love to hear from you about how the item order itself may impact student performance. So depending on which order you put the items, how can that potentially impact student performance? So we have the fatigue effects, carryover effects. Does anyone think it's recommended to start with the hard items first? Anyone think that's a good strategy?
I would say that it would also be important to consider whether students were able to make connections between prior content that was laid out in the assessment, and whether or not that would disrupt the accuracy of future items in the assessment. Whether or not the students were able to utilize what was already assessed on one of the items to help build out their response to
Yeah.
An additional one. Yeah.
So you bring up another really good point. I always highly recommend to educators that they take their own test, because sometimes when you're placing items on students, you may not know that an item clues another item until you like read both of the items together. And then you're like, oh, if they get this item right, then they might also get this item right because they are related. So that is something else that's really important to keep in mind is cluing. And so knowing the distribution of items and which items come first or second can be really important with that. And if they can go back and forth. So sometimes testing programs will let you go back and sometimes they won't. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Dr. Flores,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but that means that you have to know what the intent of the outcome is.
Yes.
Once you're right, and you need to also then measure, going back to what you were saying, measure the validity and reliability, and then you align it. You align it, and then you also have to show transparency to
Yeah.
know what the intent of the outcome is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yes.
isn't that because then you're not going to have the clarity of what you're trying to assess,
Yeah,
whether the skills or
absolutely.
competencies.
So that brings up another good point. And so by the educator participating in the test first, you can also kind of deconstruct the assessment to know if it really is going to assess what you intended. So are students going to take the items in a way or participate in the items in a way where it really matches the intent of what you were hoping to accomplish? So that's another way to kind of think through that as well.
Can I actually call out Scott's
Yeah.
comment here? He said that he sets, let's see, he likes to alternate from easy to hard and use the questions to build on each other. Scott, would you be able to just respond to this and kind of just share a little bit about what you're describing here in using the questions to build on each other?
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I put my video on too. My office is a wreck, but I teach art, and so there's a lot. I mean, I do agree. When you're talking about clues, it's really easy to build off of another one if you get that one right or you get the other one right. So when I'm writing a test, I look at everything that I want them to know, and I only choose one of those topics, so I don't do that. But if it is something conceptually that I want them to know, whether it's balance or how our elements are used, what I will do is the sequence in that way, it builds sort of on that previous question. So in a sense, I'm trying to activate knowledge that they already have. So it's not cluing, but what it does is if they do go in the sequence, they're going to do a whole lot better. But then I do try to alternate like a thoughtful question with a maybe not so thoughtful question, or maybe I'll throw something in like with a hot spot for those visual learners, something that gives them some sort of pause. So I don't know. It's hard writing tests because I'm neurodivergent and it's just difficult for me to take tests. So I try to think about everybody, and I probably obsess more than I should.
Well, the good news is you're being very thoughtful about it. And in some instances, I'm not sure that that's always happening. So we all appreciate that.
Well, I mean, I try to model what I teach because I direct our Center for Teaching and Learning.
Yeah.
And if I don't do that,
Mm-hmm.
those inconsistencies, I mean, the same thing happens with our students. I mean, you want them
Yeah.
to be like, everyone's upset about like cheating and everything else, but I mean, you can build a better mousetrap,
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to have just multiple choice questions. And the thing that I've learned personally is that not everyone does great on every single assignment. Why not
Yeah.
give them three options and then let them do what they want to do?
Yeah.
Who cares? As long as they get the concept, I don't,
Right.
I'm not upset.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing, kind of with the point that you bring up, is I think it's also important to think about when you're a student and your testing experience and what kinds of things drove you crazy. So, like, do you want to bounce around between all of the content? Like, every question is completely different. And then you're like, oh, I answered this idea 10 questions ago. Or did you like it better when they grouped the questions to where they were similar and then you moved on to like the next chunk of items? So some of those things that kind of you may have from your own test taking experience, like you can rely on some of those strategies too. Like what drove you crazy as a test taker?
Tina actually dropped a comment in earlier in the chat about that. She said that she had a math professor who would include questions that had content from the Green Lantern movies as part of the item design, and she didn't even know about the movie or anything like that, and so it actually made it challenging for her
Yeah.
to understand the questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
great example.
I'm going to pipe back in again because I'm trying to figure out all this stuff about accessibility, and I thought it would be fun to like play off of, because the faculty are really apprehensive, and I thought I'd play off of like lyrics and songs. So my module in Canvas was let's get accessible and yeah, all this other stuff. And then the more I thought about it, but those people who don't have pop culture references, that's not accessible to them. And so I stopped. So I mean, even when we have the best intentions of trying to like
Yeah.
bring people in, like with the Green Lantern, you're going to alienate more people than probably are going to get it.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I would just keep in mind is I think there's places where you can have some of that in a circumstance that isn't a high stakes assessment. So when you're trying to build on like engagement and different things, there's probably opportunities for that. But when you're having a student participate in assessment where they can't ask, or they're intimidated to ask any questions, like that may not be the best place to like introduce a lot of context that they may not know or understand.
And that first, may I also kind of piggyback on what Scott said too? I mean, you're talking about the equity issue, but also the consistency across modalities or sessions,
Right.
right? And so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So basically with form construction, I will just say that the order that you provide the items will likely have some sort of impact to student performance. So at least having that as part of your process of development, I think is important. So my second point is really, I think the key takeaway is that they should somehow be intentionally arranged rather than just kind of like quickly compiled and given to students. And my big recommendation is, to the extent that it's possible, actually take the test before you give it to students, because that will eliminate a lot of places for confusion or questions later. So remind me when I need to be done by, because I could talk on assessment all day.
We usually, it's up to you, but we usually go around like 11:30 at the most, or 11:20.
Okay.
So you
I'll
should
wrap
have
up
it.
in the next like 5 or 10 minutes, I promise. Okay.
Thank you.
So in terms of data, I typically spend some time talking about the difference between quantitative and qualitative. Again, from an educator perspective, I don't spend a lot of time on the terminology itself, but just I think it's important for them to think about times that they may use more qualitative information and how that can be used, and then times that it's more appropriate to use quantitative information. I typically try to share with them a few analyses that I think are helpful. Again, depending on their preparation, data analysis may or may not have been heavily included for teacher preparation. And so giving them a few pieces in their toolkit, I think, is important. One that I mentioned before is the distractor analysis. So to the extent that they can build distractors and assessments that are misconceptions and kind of inform if there's patterns or issues that can be identified in the items instead of just choosing random choices, I think are helpful. And then in Indiana, we have been using computer adaptive assessments for a while, or computer adaptive tests. And so I think it's also important just for teachers to understand how these work for students, meaning that if students engage in content that's lower difficulty and aren't successful, that their likelihood that they're going to achieve a high score is very unlikely. And so for educators, sometimes they just don't have enough context or detail about how computer adaptive tests work to kind of make some of those connections. So some of my kind of main ideas are that I think every step in the assessment development process should be very intentional. So while lots of tools and resources exist, whether it's curriculum or AI or websites that they download them from, I don't think that any of those in isolation are in and of themselves bad. But I do think that all of them require like a thoughtful review. So before resources used, the teacher should be thinking about what their blueprint should look like, and then they can pull in pieces that align to that blueprint, but not necessarily just picking something to use and not thoroughly investigating its alignment. Okay. So I'd love to hear from you in terms